All right, cool. So this unit, we will be discussing the properties of a digital image. And so there's certain factors that we look for in a digital image, and those factors are listed. They are receptor exposure, spatial resolution, and distortion. And so these are the three factors that we have to be aware of when our images are being created. We want to basically optimize the images so that all of these factors are being used properly. Okay. And so these are the three factors that we will see: receptor exposure, spatial resolution, distortion. Depending on how long ago you went to school to be an LMRT, you may have learned a fourth category, which would have been contrast, because contrast at the time was affected by a lot of things. However, in the new digital system, contrast is now just affected by the post processing techniques. Whenever you guys are using your mouse to, window width and window level, that is changing the contrast, right? Another way contrast is changed by selecting the piece of anatomy that, you select AP chest, you shoot an AP chest on the AP chest algorithm. That's the contrast that will be displayed, right? So it all changes based on the computer's processing now. And so that's why contrast made its way away from this area. And so we're left with three. And so when we are looking at this, these are the properties that affect visibility and accuracy of our image. And so when we talk about being able to see our image, that's the image receptor exposure. We have to have a proper amount of image receptor exposure and the correct amount of image receptor exposure to be able to see our image. If we don't, or we have too much, our image starts to fade, right? We don't see it anymore. With accuracy, what we're looking for is how well we can represent the part we're imaging on that imaging plate. And so spatial resolution, distortion are the two things that affect that. With visibility, image receptor exposure is the factor. It used to be called density. So depending on who taught you in your LMRT program, they may have, talked about density, right, as a substitute word for image receptor exposure. Because back in the day, density was what we called this factor with film. And so it's not technically wrong, but the correct term that you have to know is image receptor exposure. That is the term you will see on the registry. Okay. And so image receptor exposure just is how it sounds. When you talk about how much photons reach the IR, that's how much exposure is reaching the image receptor, IR exposure. And so you can have too little, which is that quantum noise, that salt and pepper effect we saw, or too much, which is saturation, which is the detector element receiving so much radiation that it, gets saturated or it just appears as a black shade. Now, brightness. When you talk about brightness and image receptor exposure are not synonymous. Brightness only refers to the monitor and the functions we can use on the monitor. It is not affecting how much image receptor exposure is on our detectors. And that makes sense, right? So when you window width and window level, you're changing the contrast and the brightness of that image. But just because it's getting brighter doesn't mean we're changing how much X-ray was on the image receptor. So image receptor exposure is referring to how much X-ray is going to be at the detector. Simple as that. Brightness is what we can edit on the computer screen. Just like how you can adjust your brightness on your smartphone, is the same way we can adjust the brightness of our images, but it's a monitor function, not what happens at the detector. And so we're going to talk about these factors. Pretty much they stay the same as what you should know them as. And so we're going to go through them. When we talk about receptor exposure, the first factor that comes to mind is MAS, or mass, right? Milliamperes per second. Essentially, if you increase the mass, as you can see in the image, there's more X-rays, right, that are produced at the X-ray tube. And so when there's more X-rays at the X-ray tube, and we're keeping everything constant, the body, right? We're keeping the body part the same. From when we use, say, 10 MAS to 40 MAS, you will see an increase of amount of X-rays that reach the detector. Okay. So there's a direct relationship. If MAS increases, so does receptor exposure. KVP. With KVP, it also affects receptor exposure, because KVP affects the quality of our X-ray beam, right? The penetrability of the X-ray beam all depends on the KVP. We've heard that throughout our training, right? And so when we increase KVP, we're saying, hey, I'm going to make these X-rays stronger so that they can go through this body, right? Because if they're not strong enough, those photons will get absorbed by the body. But if we start making them stronger, they're going to push past the body and hit the image receptor. And so whenever we increase KVP, we're creating stronger photons. That makes more X-rays hitting the image receptor. SID. So whenever we increase the SID, we are decreasing the receptor exposure. The further back we pull our X-ray tube, the less likely that the X-rays will hit our image receptor. Okay. In a clinical context, how you can look at this is, if you go from 40 to 72, what do you guys do to your mass, right? You typically have to increase it. And so if we have to increase from 40 to 72, that means we're losing X-rays as we pull back further, okay? So the further you get back, the less chance the X-ray hits the image receptor, okay? Another way to look at it, the inverse square law, it operates under that same fashion. Our tube is less intense, or our X-ray beam is less intense, the further it is from the source, right? So the further the source is, the less intense the beam will be at the detector. There's a bunch of formulas in here. I'll let you read on your own. You probably have seen them multiple times throughout your career, but they just basically showcase what was the inverse square law, the 15% rule, this exposure maintenance formula where you showcase how much mass you'll need if you change distances, things like that. Okay, all those formulas that you've done in the past. With grids, when you put a grid on your image receptor, what you are doing now is putting something in between the X-ray tube and the image receptor. And so grids absorb scatter, but they also absorb some of our good X-rays. And so whenever you add a grid, it reduces image receptor exposure. Okay. How I look at this concept is, anytime I add something extra in between the source of the X-rays, which is our X-ray tube, and the image receptor, that is going to absorb more radiation. Anytime I add something in between those 2 points. And so when we add a grid that's adding something in between those 2 points, that's more things it has to get through. That X-ray photon has to go through. And so when there's more things to go through, there's less likelihood that it reaches the receptor because it has to go through those things. With filtration, when we talk about total filtration, this is a negligible effect. Okay. Total filtration is used to clean low energy photons absorbed by the patient. When adding a compensating filter, right? Adding a filter decreases IR exposure. Okay. Compensating filter is different. It looks like these two items here. And notice when you add them, they're reducing the receptor exposure in these areas. Beam restriction. When you collimate, when you beam restrict, okay, that decreases the image receptor exposure. Less tissue is irradiated, which allows for less scatter to be produced, less X-rays to make it through, right? Because see, when we close up the shutters, it is closing these out, okay? So increased beam restriction, decrease in IR exposure. Anode heel effect. So when we talk about the anode heel effect, in regard to receptor exposure, what you need to know is that there is more intense X-rays at the cathode end, meaning the radiation at the cathode end is stronger. And so whenever you have a denser object, you place your denser objects on that cathode side. With anatomy and pathology, if you increase tissue thickness, increase atomic number, increase tissue density, that's more that gets put in between the source and the X-ray plate, right? And so when that happens, there's a decrease in IR exposure. There's more to go through. Now with pathologies, it's the same. When you have an additive pathology, meaning a pathology that adds to the body. So think about like ascites, which is an accumulation of fluid in the body. Now we're adding a bunch of water to your body. And so that decreases IR exposure because there's a potential that the water causes the X-rays to not make it to our image receptor. Now, destructive pathologies like osteoarthritis or osteosarcoma, that your bone is getting eaten away, right? So it removes what used to be there. And so whenever we have a destructive pathology, we will see that the image receptor exposure will increase. There's less that we have to go through. Now, accuracy. So the first one that we're going to talk about is spatial resolution. In a previous iteration, this would have been called recorded detail. That's how I learned it 15 years ago, was recorded detail. And so we are looking at the sharpness of the edges. And so how I come to talk about this is when you're looking at your image, you're going to look and say we're doing a hand X-ray. We're going to look at the edges of the fingers and make sure all of the cortical bone is outlined very well. That would be good spatial resolution if we saw all the outlines of the hand very well. Okay. And so the OID, as OID increases, spatial resolution increases. Okay. As OID decreases, I should say. And so the image here showcases it. So whenever you have a smaller OID, the spatial resolution gets better, okay? Because what happens is the edges, when you pull an object further away from the image receptor, will start to get blurry, okay? There's more unsharpness at the edges. The best way I can tell you to look at this, all right, is to get your smartphone, put it up against the wall, and shine the light up against the wall, and now put your hand in between. And when you do that, what you're going to do is bring your hand closer towards your source or the light. What you'll see is the edges of your hand will start to become blurry. That is what this is describing. Okay. With SID, as SID increases, resolution increases. So the image here showcases the same thing. When our SID is smaller, we start to see more unsharpness for in place of when SID is longer. You see better unsharpness. The same thing can be done with the flashlight, right? So start off with your hand slightly away from the wall, right? And what you want to do is you want to put your flashlight super close to your hand, right? And what you're going to see is you're going to see it's blurry at the edges of your fingers. As you pull your phone away from your hand, you're going to start to see your hand's edges start to get more crisp. That is what this is describing. And now, when we're looking at this, when you are imaging, these are the basic principles that you have learned. You want to reduce OID, right? You want your object basically touching your receptor if you can at all possible. And you want to use the longest practical SID that you can use, okay? Because those will give you the best spatial resolution. Now, something that changes nowadays that we really don't control anymore is going to be the focal spot size. So back in the day, you used to be able to choose which focal spot you're going to use. Nowadays, most X-ray tubes are choosing the focal spot for you. Okay. And so when we start to look at this, you need to know that small focal spots increase spatial resolution. And the image here showcases it. So when there is a small focal spot, the unsharpness edges are less than when there's a larger focal spot. Okay. Now, when we talk about motion, when you look at motion, what you're seeing is any motion results in blurring of the image. Okay, so this could be patient motion, tube motion, motion from a reciprocating grid, right? So whenever there's motion, you lose spatial resolution. Easiest example is get your phone out, open the camera app, and try to take a picture of your hand while you're moving your hand, right? And so when you do that, what you should see is you don't see the edges of your hand at all, right? Because the spatial resolution is degraded with motion, okay? We can basically practice a lot of the principles that we see here just with a light and a flashlight and a camera, right? Or a smartphone, right? You could see all some of the principles in real life. With pathology, it just all depends. So with patient thickness, that will decrease spatial resolution if you increase it. The thicker the part, the more likelihood that you see unsharpness at the edges. You can see the image here. Pathology is dependent. So depending on the pathology, you can have a decrease in resolution. Think about some pathologies such as tremors or Parkinson's, where a patient has uncontrollable motion, right? We go back to the motion aspect. And so that's what we're seeing, okay? With angle indirectly affects spatial resolution. When we angle along a part, the image becomes not accurate, right? So the spatial resolution can become not correct, in all honesty. And so the spatial resolution is degraded when we angle across it. And so that's what you're seeing here, right? Some of these areas are not sharp because they're striking at an angle. Another one that we talk about is going to be the pixel size and pitch. It wasn't on that graph, but it's important to note that in digital imaging, pixel size is important and pitch. Smaller pixels, lower pitch, both of those things increase spatial resolution. Okay. Again, we have the image that we talked about in the previous class showcasing why. The smaller the pixels, the better we can get more shades into an image. And so with more shades and more surface area, we're able to see more than when we have we have larger pixels and not as many, right? Because then we start to see averaging occur and it doesn't look sharp. The final thing that we discuss today is going to be distortion. Okay. Um, with distortion, what we're looking at is the misrepresentation of what we're imaging. And so there's a couple factors that can go into that. And so the two types of distortion that we see is size and shape distortion. So size deals with magnification. That's the OID, SID. Shape is going to be part distortion, right? Part distortion, which is elongation or foreshortening. That's improper angle or improper alignment of the part and two. Okay. And so here's the factors of distortion. Um, and so that's what we're seeing here. And so with distortion, what we're looking at, if you increase OID, you increase magnification, and that increases distortion. So you can see in the image here, again, you could use the flashlight with your hand to showcase it. But the closer the object is to the image receptor, the better it is as far as magnification. The bigger the OID or the larger the OID is, the more likelihood it looks bigger than it appears. And that's what you're seeing in these images here. Okay. SID. As SID increases, magnification decreases. All right. And so distortion decreases. And it's the same thing with the flashlight. Get the flashlight out, move your hand um, slightly away from the wall, and then move your flashlight or your phone further back and then towards your hand, and you're gonna see that the distortion. Your hand's gonna be huge when the SID is short, and then when the SID is long, your hand appears probably more regular sized. The magnification formula is here, which you guys should have seen before, but I provide an example that showcases how to work through it. So you can look at those on your own. And it just works it through. These are just directly from the textbook. I'm sure you guys have had to do some of these problems in the past. So these are just showcasing you the examples of them. As far as patient factors, increase in size or thickness of the part will increase distortion if the part's further away. Pathology is dependent, as some pathologies will make distortion more evident. And so with distortion, the patient factors are all dependent. And so there isn't really a straight fire increase or decrease for this one. It just depends on the actual pathology. All right. And the last thing we're going to go over today is the angle. And so we talked about how magnification plays in. With this here, what we're seeing is we are seeing increasing the angle will increase distortion. And that's what we know, right? because you can see if your part is not, in alignment with the plates or with the tube, you can get a distorted image, right? That's why we want to make sure our part plate beam is in alignment. Um, because if not, you can get a foreshortened X-ray or a elongated X-ray or a distorted X-ray from what it's supposed to look like. And so it's important we keep the two part and IR and angulation in alignment, because if you increase the angle, you for sure will increase the distortion. All right, guys, that is it for the lecture. I'll be grading the assignments for the week here shortly. Um, we are past the midway point. We should be wrapping up our course here in the next 2 weeks for lectures, and then there's going to be a final exam week 8. Keep on task with all the assignments. Everybody's been turning them in. I've been reviewing them. They're looking good. Always read for the comments. If I make any, usually I'll put in there if you got something wrong and why you got it wrong. So look at those things. Other than that, guys, take care. I'll see y'all next week. We'll do quality assurance next week. Next week is a bunch of remembering. All right. So get a head start once you finish up this chapter on next week, because there is a lot of memorization for next week's chapter. And so the quiz will reflect that. And so you want to probably get a handle on that because there is, highlighted things that I put on the PowerPoint that I want y'all to know, because those are directly related to things we've seen on the registry before. Okay. Taisha, what's your question? You can unmute or you can type at the bottom. And everybody else, you're free to go. Ooh, I can't hear you. Maybe you need to type it.